And then if you got a board of directors, that's a good thing. Some companies aren't big enough to have that. If they've got a board of advisors, that's a good thing. And ask, is anybody there an investor, or are they just there to get their name on a piece of paper? Occasionally, particularly with more government involvement in industry, you see these interesting convoluted consortium of companies, universities, government agencies. Canada was famous for that, and they tried to start a biotech industry like that, and I had the good fortune to hire several people away from Canada because they got tangled up in this thing. Those things went nowhere. But be really, really worried about that if it depends on government contracts and such like that. There are some startups that are R&D tax credit schemes, and the R&D tax credit isn't the same thing it was 20 years ago, but beware of that. And again, if the management or board of investors or advisors doesn't have people with skin in the game, I'd be a little concerned. So often companies talk about the next round of financing, how everything's going to be great. You know, we're going to get these people on board, we're going to launch our beta version, everything's going to be great. But it's fair to ask a couple just basic questions like, you know, what are the milestones? What's it going to take for somebody else to invest in you? Not when you're next meeting with a venture capitalist, not somebody that rattles off the names of the venture capital firms they're talking to. That stuff doesn't really matter. And do they have a plan B? You know, are they so passionate about their idea that even if they don't get their money, they can winnow things down and they can just sort of go at a minimal burn rate and get things done? And then lastly, you know, what's the exit or the acquisition plan? Are they dreaming that they're going to have an initial public offering of stock? That's always a red flag too. So magical thinking, IPO, gigantic single order, or we're somehow going to reduce the burn rate. And reducing the burn rate means laying people off. So if their plan B is to reduce the burn rate, that's you going out the door as the new kid, you know. It's fair to ask for a couple milestones. I'm not saying show me the timeline. In fact, it's better if you don't see a timeline. It's better that everybody understands, here's a couple things we got to achieve, and somebody's willing to invest in us then. If they don't have a sense for that, it doesn't make sense. If they're an army of grant writers, that's good for a particular phase of a company, but for a later phase, it's not going to build somebody towards a liquidation event or an acquisition. So I worry a little bit about that. You know, the blind optimism, oh, don't worry, everything's going to be okay. And the first place I was at had the opportunity to pursue some venture capitalists. They were originally funded by several companies, and I was just a green kid out of school, and all I heard was how terrible venture capitalists were. And I was in the Bay Area, which is, you know, venture capital heaven, and I didn't really understand. Well, the main reason in that case they were bad-mouthing venture capitalists is because a venture capital firm would have come in and kick out the president and the scientist who is the president's girlfriend, and you know, they would have cleaned house, and ultimately, so that's why they were bad-mouthing venture capitalists all the time, and so they didn't get a second round of financing, and the companies that funded them actually did the very thing. They booted out the president and fired a bunch of people, and you know, they made things happen. So sometimes venture capitalists can create a certain level of discipline and financial control that can be beneficial. Also, look for ideas, look for things that have been just going on for too long. Too long, you know, round D of financing, or why have they been doing it for so long? And especially if they're looking to get funding to buy out disgruntled early investors. It's a common thing, it's a common sort of recapitalization approach, and I'd be really, really concerned unless something has changed in the environment where the plane is no longer heading to the ground, it's going to turn up and fly away. And if you find any of those, tell me. I'd like to invest in those. I haven't seen them. Now, you don't have to be an accountant, and you don't have to get into really the finances, but everybody likes to show a growth curve, and it looks like a hockey stick, right? Everything's going to be great. It's going to be fantastic. It's going to go up. And you have to ask, well, why is that? And who are you going to sell that? Who's going to buy your product? And most importantly, what's your go-to-market strategy? You know, one company I was with said, we don't need any, and I'll get rid of the expletives, sales department or salesmen, we just need an 800 number. And that person was wrong. And a balance sheet is a reasonable thing. I walked into the second startup because they'd given me some financial information, and I didn't know anything. I said, what is all this on the balance sheet called intangibles? What is that? And something like 70% of the assets of the company were these intangibles. And I said, could you just tell me what the intangibles were? And the person couldn't. And I wasn't so much concerned about the fact it was intangible, but more so that people couldn't tell me what was in there. And that was a little concerning. Excel is a wonderful program. You can do great graphs. You can do spreadsheets on top of spreadsheets on top of spreadsheets. You can do very, very thick business plans. I've seen lots of very thick business plans, and it can look really, really realistic. But you know, take a look at it. And probably most importantly, when you see a sales projection of how bright their future is going to be, it's going to be a very, very different kind of company. If that's maybe a 1 year or an 18-month kind of sales curve, a fair question to ask is, you know, you're showing a picture of something that's going to be a very, very, very different kind of company. And what's that company like, and who are the people that are going to run that? Because that's a kind of question I have to ask CEOs, but I have to be more blunt and say, this is a very different kind of company you're projecting in the future. Are you the person to run it? And I've had the good fortune, I've had a couple people say no, and I'm already recruiting for my replacement. But it'll be a very, very different kind of company if their sales projections happen, and it's a fair question. The balance sheet, you don't have to go through it in great detail, but you know, ask some questions. And if patents are on the balance sheet, are these patents they owned, or is it royalty, or just, you know, how does it work? And then lastly, I tell people this, they don't believe it, but one startup I worked at bought the building. Instead of equipping the lab and instead of doing things, they actually bought the building. That's not critical to the mission, so beware of stuff like that. So there's a whole bunch of stuff. Ultimately, though, you have to make a decision. You have to use your intellect. You have to use your intuition. You have to make value judgments. You know, you talk to the management. Is this a reasonable person? Is this a joker? You know, how do I feel about that? And as Michael alluded to, you got to know what's your risk-reward curve. How much chaos can you tolerate? And then lastly, probably most importantly, if you go in, you got to go in with total commitment, not just your time, but rather all your energy. And that's probably one of the things that differentiates a startup from a lot of other companies. People aren't walking around waiting for the third cup of coffee to get kick-started in the morning. They're up and they're going, and it's very exciting. So hopefully that's useful. And are there any questions on that? Or we can talk more at the end. And it'll take a lot of glasses of wine before I tell you who some of these people are. So. Anyway, thank you.